So welcome, dear friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitudes Center Zoom session. Tomorrow is Palm Sunday, April 2nd, 2023, and I'm going to talk today about Jesus's spectacular nonviolence during Holy Week and try to point out some lessons for us. So before I begin, I just remind everybody to mute yourselves and to write any questions in the chat link, and I'll speak for about 45 minutes and then take questions for about 45 minutes. And then we'll end the Zoom recording link, and those who want to stay on and talk a little more, we can, and we will send out the recording in a couple of days. Also, there's many other amazing, wonderful people going to be doing Zooms for us in the next few months. So I hope you'll check out beatitudecenter.org. So it's Holy Week, and let's begin with a prayer. So I invite us into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely. And let's all welcome the nonviolent Jesus here into our circle. And we'll take a moment to begin in silence. Beloved God, be with us as we begin Holy Week. Help us to enter the story of the nonviolent Jesus, to reflect on his life and death and resurrection from the perspective of nonviolence, to accompany him this Holy Week through his action in the temple, the Last Supper in Gethsemane, to his death and resurrection, and give us the grace to be his faithful nonviolent followers and friends who walk with him on the path of nonviolence all the way to the cross and resurrection, that we might do our part to serve you, to do your will, to spread your way of loving nonviolence, and to welcome your reign of universal love and total nonviolence here on earth. Amen. So again, everybody, a very warm welcome. My take here, as I'm trying to work on my Zoom here, is that, well, I'm going to walk through the story of Holy Week with you. And so this is very serious stuff. And so I invite us into a spirit of prayer and reflection and peace and even retreat. And that as I'm talking, and I might go on, so brace yourself. Feel free to, journal or get water or coffee, just to be comfortable in a spirit of peace and meditation, because that's really the best way, I think, to go through the passion and death and resurrection of Jesus in a spirit of prayer. And as I propose, some of you have heard all of this before, some of you have heard some of this before, and some of you have never heard any of this before. So but if you go in a spirit of prayer, it's all okay. But I'm proposing that the Sermon on the Mount and the Gospels announce that in the life of the nonviolent Jesus, the living God is completely different than everything we've been taught about him. Everything that the culture says about God is different from the story of the nonviolent Jesus, especially the Holy Week story. And that we've been taught something completely different and really been brainwashed by the culture of violence. And that's why, I keep saying these same things over and over again, that according to the nonviolent Jesus, the living God is universal love, universal compassion, and universal peace, which means God is infinite, universal nonviolence beyond our comprehension. Furthermore, that Jesus is the fullest revelation of this God of universal love and total nonviolence. And he invites us and calls us and summons us to follow him along his way of universal love and total nonviolence into God's reign of universal love and total nonviolence. It's spectacularly beautiful. And of course, we live in a world of total violence. And we've been brainwashed to believe the lies of violence and war and nationalism and greed and fear and success and everything. And we've internalized them even ourselves. And that means we rejected Jesus and his call and his example and his life. And 2,000 years ago, according to the Gospels, despite his spectacular nonviolence, we totally rejected him. As Daniel Berrigan once said, we showed him to the door. And of course, he came back as peaceful and nonviolent as ever, and continues to spread his underground, illegal, subversive grassroots campaign of total nonviolence. And that's what we're going to look at today. And he's summoning all of us to resist the culture of violence, to surrender ourselves to the God of peace, and to welcome God's reign of universal love here on earth. So tomorrow, for those of us who are here live on the recording, we start Holy Week when we remember Jesus's last week as he enters Jerusalem and goes to his death on Good Friday and then to Easter Sunday. So what I propose is that we're going to, first of all, we remember that the story of Jesus is that he's in the outskirts of this horrible empire, a very poor area, and he forms a community of nonviolence in Galilee. And he teaches and trains his followers in the way of universal love and total nonviolence, and then organizes and leads a grassroots people power bottom-up movement from Galilee to Jerusalem. Just like Gandhi on the Salt March, just like Dr. King in on the march from Selma to Montgomery. And that when he gets to Jerusalem, the empire crushes him. And that's what you do, empires and the cultures of violence and people of power always do to stop grassroots people power movements. They kill the leaders, because you get in trouble if you rock the boat, if you build movements that empower people and threaten the status quo, the established order of greed and war and violence. So they killed Gandhi and King and Romero, and just as they killed Jesus. And the story goes here, of course, famously, that Jesus came back and continues the campaign. And to me, this is just, well, it's the meaning of the spiritual life. It's the purpose of life. It's the way forward for all of us. It's our only hope. I'm still trying to mute a few people. So friends, if you're not muted, I encourage you to mute yourself. That would help me. So that's the journey. And one way to look at the story and the last week of the story of Jesus is, as many of you might have heard, the story, the words I was told by Daniel Berrigan when I was 21. I was sitting with him and I wanted to ask him the meaning of life. And so I said to him, I was so nervous, and I blurted out to him. I was going to say, so Dan, what's the meaning of life? And I said instead, Dan, what's the point of all this again? And without missing a beat, Daniel Berrigan said to me in 1982, all you have to do is make your story fit into Jesus's story. Well, that's the meaning of life for me. And that was the word I needed to hear. And I'm still been trying to do that ever since, to invite you to reflect with me as I'm talking. How is your story fitting into Jesus's story? And from today forward to your own Good Friday and Easter Sunday, how are you going to make your story fit in more and more into Jesus' story? So the way I want to do this is I picked out 10 scenes or episodes from Holy Week up to the Good Friday moment. I want to walk through them, and then we'll look at the resurrection scene, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. So I hope that sounds good. So here we go. Number one, he marches to Jerusalem, and when he gets to Jerusalem, after this big campaign, after sending 72 people out ahead of him, after, like Gandhi on the Salt March. He sees Jerusalem, and what does Jesus do? He breaks down sobbing. This is so important. Luke 19, verse 41. And he says, if today you had only understood the things that make for peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. For the days are coming upon you when your enemies will raise a palisade against you. So this is the beginning of Holy Week, and it's the beginning of our story today. Jerusalem and practically everyone rejected Jesus' teachings of peace, love, and nonviolence as he taught them in the Sermon on the Mount. Instead, as you know, in the year 70, there were all kinds of the violent revolutionary groups fighting the Roman occupation, until finally we know the Roman Empire came in and just decimated Jerusalem. So Luke and Matthew set the story of Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem within the context of it probably already happened. Maybe it was written 2 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. For us, today, Jerusalem has become the world. And we see that every day in the papers. We're closer to nuclear war than ever, and living in permanent warfare, systemic injustice, and just unimaginable global poverty, and now total catastrophic climate change, where we are full on destroying the earth and headed toward Mother Earth retaliating, as has to happen in scientific response to what we've done to the earth. So
wonderful meeting. If you'd like to
again, please mute yourself. I can hear you talking, friends. Thank you.
Yeah, it's this Jesuit priest. He happens to be
Hello.
spiritual director.
I'm going to take a little break here. Teresa, Irene, is that you? Can you mute yourselves?
Oh, that's me.
So again, thank you so much for muting yourselves, or for not talking. That would help, because I'm trying to stay focused on what I want to share. So Jesus teaches us that the first response to impending death and destruction of Jerusalem and the world, which has now become Jerusalem, is grief and tears and weeping. So that's how the Holy Week story begins. So my question is, how do you grieve? Or even more importantly, are you grieving for what's happening in the world? We in the United States are taught not to grieve. And I've reflected a lot on that previously, but it just invite us to make grief a regular part of our contemplative practice and daily meditation, to grieve for the children of the world, the creatures, and for Mother Earth. Like Jesus, we weep because humanity has refused to learn the things that make for peace, such as nonviolent conflict resolution and universal love. And the second thing is then, what are the things that make for peace? Do you want to learn them? And I invite us to not jump into an answer on that question. Don't rush into saying, yes, I want. Sit with the question and ask for the grace to become people who learn the things that make for peace, and to practice them and teach them and promote for the rest of our lives the things that make for peace. This is a really good Holy Week exercise, is to journal about that. What are they? Well, he laid them out in the Sermon on the Mount. And what have you learned? And what are you afraid to learn? What are you rejecting about Jesus's way of peace? And thinking that we know better. How do we cause Jesus to weep? Because we too have refused to learn the things that make for peace. So I've been proposing that they include total nonviolence, which means things like prayer, complete surrender to God's will, universal love, and public action for justice and disarmament and creation. So the thing is, how can you and I, it's a really important Holy Week question, help one another learn the things that make for peace, so that we might end our wars and abolish nuclear weapons, and help feed and heal the poor, and so protect creation, and stop digging up fossil fuels and so forth. Second, Jesus enters Jerusalem riding on a donkey. So, I'm talking about Jesus sobbing and breaking down and grieving over the world. Now, when you and I do that, we give up. That's what's so impressive to me here, among other things. We just give into despair and say nothing can be done, and that's that. That's not the nonviolent Jesus. It's also not Gandhi and Dr. King. Jesus grieves and then takes action, dramatic public action. He does two dramatic public acts. One is he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, and the next he does civil disobedience. So here we're looking at Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, the Palm Sunday story. Remember, it's Passover. So Pilate is coming into Jerusalem because everybody is required to go to Jerusalem to visit the temple for Passover. So Pilate goes in, because he lives out in his mansion out in the country, on a triumphal military parade. And he's riding on his war horse with his full military gear, and he has the whole cohort around him, 600 armed Roman soldiers, and he's making a full show of imperial force and power and military might. Okay? This is really important. And the writing is, and the brilliance of Jesus. I mean, that's why this is original to Jesus, because no one could have thought this up. He's like Gandhi, doing a symbolic public action. Actually, Jesus does street theater. He does the exact opposite of Pilate on the other side of town, in the poor side of town, riding in, not on the war horse, but on a donkey. And he's meek, gentle, humble, and nonviolent, using the symbols to describe what? A new kind of king and ruler, one of total nonviolence. So he's offering us a symbol of nonviolence. He's a king of nonviolence. But what's so spectacular is that Jesus, in his mind, I think he planned this his whole life. The older I get and as I meditate on this, is he has deliberately picked of an obscure 2 sentences from the book of Zechariah and fulfilled them. Here is the king of nonviolence who comes to abolish war and bring peace to the whole planet and the whole universe. So I'm going to read this, and I invite you to write down Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9 and 10. Go and look it up and read it. And imagine Jesus reading that as a kid and realizing he is that person. Because the question is, do we want that person? Here's the verse from Zechariah chapter 9. Rejoice heartily, O daughter Zion. Shout for joy, O daughter Jerusalem. See, your king is coming to you. A just savior is he. Meek, it's the biblical word for nonviolence, riding on a donkey, and he shall banish the war chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem. In other words, all weapons of war. The warrior's bow shall be banished and broken, and he shall proclaim peace to the nations of the world, and his dominion of peace shall be from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. Dear friends, it's one of the most spectacular 2 verses of peace in the entire Bible, and nobody knows about it or talks about it. That's what we're commemorating tomorrow on Palm Sunday, is the coming of the King of total nonviolence, bringing a new universe of total peace. This is really good news. And what did we do? We killed him. We don't want that. Do you want a king of total nonviolence? Don't rush to your answer. It's a very serious image that we're given from Zechariah and Palm Sunday. Do we want a leader who is meek and gentle and humble and coming to us as gently as Gandhi and Dr. King or, you know, we can name all kinds of saints, St. Clare and St. Francis and Mother Teresa, ending all war, breaking all the weapons of war, abolishing all nuclear weapons, and bringing a dominion of nonviolence from sea to sea. It's a spectacular image. Where are you in that scene, in that story? I invite you to pray over this. And if you do want that leader, how are you serving that leader? And what are you doing to bring about this reign of his total nonviolence? Third, again, you and I would give in despair. He goes right into the temple and does civil disobedience. Now, this is the drama, the height of the whole campaign of Jesus. It's in all four Gospels. It's the critical story in the story of Jesus, and nobody talks about it. We talk about everything else but this. And I always joke that Jesus thinks he's like he's Gandhi and Dr. King, but I've really studied Gandhi and Dr. King, and Gandhi said, I practiced nonviolent revolution because Jesus did in the temple. I was just reading that the other day. The religious authorities work with the Roman Empire to steal all the money of the poor, the faithful Jews who are coming in. They're told they have to go and visit God in the temple. It's the only place God lives, and that where he's present on earth, according to the tradition. And you have to, you know, sacrifice a lamb or a dove, and it's going to cost you, but we can't use the evil Roman money, so we're going to use our holy money, and that's going to cost you extra. And so they had a whole big banking system, and he goes in and turns over the tables of the banking system. And it says in the Synoptic Gospels, he prevented people from coming and going. So he's doing a sit-in. Would have lasted all of 3 minutes. As someone who's done 85 civil disobedience actions, that's what would have happened. And then he spent the rest of the day teaching the crowd nonviolence, and they're enthralled. But just for the record, he doesn't hit anybody, hurt anybody, kill anybody, or drop any nuclear bombs. Like Gandhi and Dr. King and all of us who do civil disobedience, Jesus is meticulously nonviolent. He's like Thich Nhat Hanh. Why? It's in the Gospel of Mark. There's a strange sentence. He walked into the temple, he looked around, and then he left the temple, period. The next morning, he walked in and turned over the tables. So to joke about it, he's casing the joint, as we did in our plowshares actions. He's seeing where things are, and he's preparing to do a symbolic nonviolent direct action, like Gandhi and Dr. King did, and we all do. And he's preparing so he can be totally nonviolent. He's not yelling at people. He's not angry. He's not raging. We already know he's crying. He's grieving, but he's not passive. He takes action. Notice he's not here to reform the temple. He's come to end the entire unjust temple cult system, which only serves the ruling class, including the religious authorities and the empire. So the religious authorities are totally furious because they're threatened, and they're right, because their entire economic and political privilege would end if his teachings are adopted. So they kill him. And Jesus might have got away with his campaigns because they were afraid, the religious authorities are afraid of the crowds, but then he's betrayed by somebody in his community. So that's what happens in the story. Now, just for the footnote, because everybody always asks me this, the Gospel of John is written probably 50 years later, friends, and he changes the entire story. The story is not a campaign of nonviolence to Jerusalem where he does civil disobedience in the temple. In the Gospel of John, he moves the civil disobedience to the beginning of the story. He changes the story, John. I figured out why in my book, the Gospel of John, called Lazarus Come Forth. He tells a completely different story at the end of the raising of Lazarus. What people don't realize is that Lazarus is the whole human race stuck in the culture of death. And Jesus does not weep because Lazarus has died. He says, I'm glad he died. Lazarus, he's calling humanity out of the culture of death. So when John, and I go into that in detail, John moves over the civil disobedience in the temple to the very beginning. He has the miracle of the water into the wine at Cana. And next thing you know, he's turning over tables in the temple. And it's there in John. We have the only time in the entire Bible, the strange, long, 100-letter word in the Greek for hemp, which we translate as rope, but it wasn't rope. It's what you use to get cattle and tens of thousands of lambs and sheeps and doves up the 5-story walkways into the temple, because you're going to kill all these animals. There's going to be blood everywhere. And it says Jesus took this hemp in the Greek, in John's gospel, and led the animals out. It does not say he struck people with rope. And that's where you get into the problem of considering Jesus violent. Jesus is meticulously nonviolent. The sheep would have seen the hemp and gone, oh, it's time to leave. Thank God. If you see what I'm saying, Jesus even saves the animals. Crystal, Jesus is a nonviolent human rights activist. But of course, we lose all of that, and we think he's violent. And so Truman said, Jesus was violent in the temple, so I can drop the bomb on Hiroshima. Do you see the insanity of our problem here? That's why I'm harping at the meticulous nonviolence of Jesus in the temple. Fourth, I get so moved and worked up over this, so you'll have to bear with me. The story of the washing of the feet. It only appears in the Gospel of John, chapter 13. It's not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Everything we've been told about it for 2,000 years is wrong. It's not about service. And the whole thing on Holy Thursday, we bend over and wash each other's feet because we're servants. Friends, that's baloney. That's not what Jesus is teaching us. Do you all know this? I don't know. Anyway, it's all in detail in my book, Lazarus Come Forth. Why? Well, according to John, there's only one woman, one person, a wholly unnamed woman. Later, she's named Mary. Possibly she's Mary of Bethany, Jesus' best friend. Okay, great. Only one person in the 4 Gospels believes Jesus and supports his going to the cross as nonviolent resistance, like Gandhi, King, Romero. You see what I'm saying? And what does she do? They're at the dinner party. She goes in unannounced. She takes the jar of expensive oil and she pours it on Jesus. Friends, she's anointing Jesus to prepare for his execution. It's so touching and so brilliant. She is the only one serving Jesus, not the male disciples. And she's saying, okay, Jesus, you can do this. I bless you and anoint you and prepare you to go to the cross, which is clearly what's going to happen. If you're doing civil disobedience in the outskirts of the empire, you're going to get executed within 24 hours. Everybody else is terrified. She's not. She's blessing him and preparing him. If you do the math and you're still with me, Jesus has an aha moment and learns from the holy woman. And so it says he went around the table. Now, this is where you get it from the Greek. Every word, the writing in John's gospel is genius. And I tried to unpack it in my book. He bent over. He took up the cross. He rose from the table. It's all Paschal mystery language. In other words, this is the story of the risen Jesus. We think he's washing his feet, but he says, you don't understand what I'm doing. And we don't understand either. The early church did not need to learn anything about service. They were servants, and incredible servants. We're not servants. We don't know how to do that. They were getting executed every day. If you were baptized, you were beheaded that afternoon. They needed to help each other, prepare each other for their upcoming martyrdoms. That's why John put the story in, if you're still with me. And it's very hard for us to grasp the story of the washing of the feet, which is an anointing and a preparation for preparing the disciples for their own upcoming martyrdoms. He's preparing the early church to be martyred. Because if you say, I'm following Jesus, God is God, not Caesar, you're going to be killed. And all the early community is being killed. We've lost all that today. But this story was almost actually made a sacrament in the church because they still understood this in the 1300s. So, like, for example, there's the line, Peter says, oh, no, not me. And Jesus says, if I don't wash you, you can have no part of my lineage. So if Jesus is anointed, then he anoints the disciples, then they go and anoint everyone in the early community, which is what they did. The anointing by the washing of the feet was prepare each other to go to the cross. And if you don't do that, you are not part of the lineage of nonviolence. So this story has been lost, and so is the lineage of nonviolence, but not quite. It was reclaimed by Tolstoy and then Gandhi and Dorothy Day and Martin Luther King and the Berrigans, and now it's coming back for the first time. But, so where are you in the story? Do you want to be anointed for the cross, to go all the way on the journey of nonviolence? Do you want to be part of Jesus's lineage? It's fantastic language. Fifth, the Last Supper. Again, friends, some of you have heard me share about this. This is all in my book, Walking the Way, which now has a new edition, which has my friend's beautiful artwork on it, Walking the Way of Jesus on Palm Sunday. It's Passover. He's in the upper room. The community of men and women are around him. He takes the cup and says, this is my body broken for you. The bread, this is my body broken for you. The cup, this is my blood broken, shed for you. And we're so used to the Eucharist now that we've lost what Jesus did. There's a little tiny phrase, I think it's only in Luke, where he says, I have longed for this moment. I think Jesus planned to do this for years and years, because I think Jesus was a genius, the greatest genius who ever lived. I'm being silly, but you get my point. The Passover, he takes it and totally transforms it. It was brilliant. What should Jesus have done? You've heard me say this maybe. If he were a good American, if he were Putin, if he were Hitler, if he were Caesar. Go break their bodies for me. Go shed their blood for me, because I'm God. No, my body broken for you. My blood shed for you. Do this. This is the new covenant of nonviolence. It changes all of biblical history, the Hebrew tradition, and life. And Gandhi and Martin King tried to teach us, using this clumsy word of nonviolence, to understand the story of Jesus. And it's right there in the Eucharist, and we are blind to it. Every time you participate in the Eucharist, you are participating in the new covenant with God of gospel nonviolence. I am going to now being trained to give my body for others, shed my blood for others. I am not shedding anybody else's blood. I do not take anybody else's bodies. This is the covenant of nonviolence. Do this is the commandment. Now, if you are following through with me on this theology of nonviolence or even Eucharistic nonviolence. This means that war is the anti-Eucharist. Since I don't have too much time, I'm just going to come right out with it. Right? Where we break the bodies and shed the blood of Christ all over the world today. And we are doing this from, sure, Ukraine, but in Gaza and Iraq, still in Syria and Afghanistan, Mexico, and all the gun violence that's happening, and all the killings that just go on and on around our world. No, in our plan to destroy the planet through our nuclear weapons, we have 13,000 of them. We've got rid of all the nuclear treaties through catastrophic climate change, through our ongoing destruction of the environment and digging up fossil fuels. That's the anti-Eucharist. Which are you participating in? These are deep things to ponder this week. 6, this is just a general theme to note, in my opinion, as you go through Holy Week. And I get this from the Gospel of John, and this is from my friend Henry Nouwen, who I heard say this in 1985. Throughout the Holy Week story, everybody is running away from Jesus, and Jesus is moving closer to us. It is so touching and beautiful. It's way beyond nonviolence. It's almost beyond love, if there is such a thing. The intimacy of God coming to us as we're getting ready to kill God. What do I mean? Jesus says, this is all in John 15. I no longer call you servants. I call you my friends. I get this because my friend Daniel Berrigan long ago wrote a poem called Good Friday, where he asked, do we want a God who wants to be our friend? Do you want to be friends with this nonviolent Jesus? No, everybody ran away from him, and everybody in the world, beginning with Christians, are running away from him still today. That's why I'm saying go slow with these questions. Spend Holy Week sitting with these. So just to reflect on, you can go look that up in John 15 if you want. Jesus says, I no longer call you servants, you're my friends. And this is at the Last Supper. How are the disciples responding? They start arguing which one of them, the men, the male disciples, are the greatest. It's a classic male ego, domination, narcissism, overprivilege. I know all about these things too. And Judas betrays him, and Peter's going to even deny knowing him, but all of them in all the Gospels, especially Mark, men and women, his community, abandon him. I mean, that's important. Everybody abandoned him. As they're running out the back door, Jesus is running after us, trying to be closer to us, to be intimate friends with us. Henry went on to say in the resurrection, he says, I love you so much. I want to be your food and your drink. I want to be the air you breathe. He even calls his betrayer friend. That's how the depths of the nonviolent Jesus. This is hours before he's tortured and executed. We have a God who wants to be our friend, and humanity doesn't want God as a friend. So what is your understanding of friendship and intimacy with God as you reflect on the new covenant of nonviolence and the Holy Week story of Jesus, and the political context of it? What are the politics of this nonviolent friendship with Jesus? How are you a faithful friend of the nonviolent Jesus? Which leads me to the Garden of Gethsemane. Boy, excuse me, but I'm talking way too much, but oh well, this is what you get. So I'm going to keep going. Now we're in the Garden of Gethsemane. So my question, Gandhi says Jesus is the greatest person of nonviolence in history. Okay. And then Gandhi says Jesus goes deeper, deeper, deeper into nonviolence in his execution. And I've really read Gandhi, and I find him greater than any theologians I've read in all of grad school, because Gandhi is reading it from total nonviolence and from Gandhi's own inevitable martyrdom. He knew he was going to be killed. And he's reading it like, wow, Jesus is infinitely loving and nonviolent. And Gandhi's question, but I think more, maybe it wasn't Gandhi's question. My question is, how did Jesus do it? I'm going to be silly again and say I figured it out. But that's my question, and I ask you to reflect with me. How does Jesus do it? We see the answer in the Garden of Gethsemane, and there's a lot to talk about in this story. Now, that's the safe place, the little campground on the other side of the Kidron Valley, the Mount of Olives, looking over the old city of Jerusalem, where Jesus retreated every night. And he was doing, in effect, nonviolent raids, civil disobedience actions, and retreating in prayer there to this garden. And it's there that he's arrested. So first of all, after the Eucharist, the Passover meal, they go back to the garden, and Jesus prays 3 times with Peter and James and John nearby and the others nearby. And we know the story, and it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the way I interpret this is that Jesus recenters himself in total intimate relationship with God. And here's my word, using Jean-Pierre de Caussade. Jesus surrendered himself to God all over again, which is what he learned from his mother, according to Luke. I'm the servant of God. Let your will be done, not my will be done. And then Jesus says the famous prayer, not my will, but your will be done. He accepted God's will and received an inner strength to go forward to torture and execution in peace. Every molecule of his being is focused on God in prayer. Not my will, your will be done. So 3 times he tells his friends to keep watch with him, and what do? They fall asleep. Earlier, like an hour ago, they had argued about which one of them was the greatest. And Peter bragged that he'd be willing to go to jail and die for Jesus. And now they're falling asleep while Jesus is praying in agony in the garden, a few feet away from them. And we could use this image of the sleeping male disciples as an image of the sleeping male-dominated patriarchal church today, sleeping through the agony of the crucified peoples in the world, arguing about stupid things instead of keeping watch with Christ. Today, the whole world has become Gethsemane, and we are called to keep perpetual contemplative watch with the nonviolent Jesus. But not like the male disciples who are asleep. We're called to be awake. So I invite you to reflect, how are you waking up? How do you keep watch with the nonviolent Jesus? How do you stay present to the crucified peoples of the world? Here comes Judas, betraying him for money, leading the soldiers in authority to arrest him. And he mocks Jesus, saying, "Hail, Rabbi," as if Jesus was the emperor. And he kisses Jesus. Jesus is totally nonviolent. On the other hand, they've got, swords, it's torches, it's so scary, all the soldiers, his friend betraying him, and Jesus calls him my friend and says, do what you have come for. I invite you to reflect. It's really, if you want to go deep with Jesus, always try to reflect on how is he feeling. So how does Jesus feel being betrayed by his friend? The Psalms say it was his best friend. How did he feel having his community break up and abandon him? And I've thought a lot about this because of all that's happened to me by the church. Sometimes I think every one of us, sooner or later, the more you get involved in the church and nonviolence, you get betrayed by the church, by those closest to us in the community. So when have you been betrayed by the church? And how did you respond? Were you nonviolent like Jesus? The poet Robert Bly says that the only way to become wise is through betrayal, because we all get betrayed, but you become wise if you remain nonviolent and surrendered to God like Jesus did in Gethsemane. That's the teaching: to forgive, to stay centered in prayer, to even love your betrayers, and to let go of resentments and to be mindful. And then you discover the wisdom of nonviolence and compassion. But the even deeper question is, who have you betrayed? And perhaps the invitation of Gethsemane is not to betray Jesus and not to betray anyone, to become non-violent, non-betrayers, faithful friends and servants of Jesus. But that's still not what I want to talk about. If you're still with me, let me just check the Zoom here for a second. I think some of you are still there. The key to all of this is the prayer. And again, I didn't make this up. The Gospel of Luke begins with Mary saying, "Not my will, your will be done. Let it be done according to your will." So she taught Jesus that prayer, which Luke ends the Gospel in, "Not my will, your will be done." Friends, I invite us to make that the prayer of the rest of our lives, if it's not already. It can become our Holy Week prayer, our mantra. Something to be said about 1,000 times a day. And you're going, "Oh, John, you're being silly." No, 3 weeks ago, I don't think he's on here, my spiritual director, who is an abbot at a famous monastery, I started telling him this. He goes, offhandedly, he said, "Oh, that's what I do. I say, 'Not my will, your will be done,' 1,000 times a day." He said that to me. I know someone who does this. He should do it. He's a monk, but they're supposed to be teaching us how to pray. That's how you pray. This is the reason we're all insane with violence, because we're not surrendered to God's will. If you're surrendered to God's will, you don't need a sword in Gethsemane, or a gun, or to be scared, or afraid of death or arrest. Not my will, your will be done. I surrender myself to you completely. Now, that's the key here, because you and I think, "Oh, no, I like God. I like Jesus. I'm doing God's will." If you are doing 90% of your will is God's will, you're not doing God's will. On your best day, the best moment in your life, maybe you let go and you were doing God's will 99% of the time. You were still doing your will. You were not doing God's will. Why? Because it's like hanging from a branch by a finger. You're still hanging on and trying to be in control. That 1% is you still being in control. Only when you surrender and let go. I surrender myself completely, 100% to God and God's will. And you walk forward. Are you doing God's will? That's Jesus in Gethsemane. He doesn't have to struggle anymore. He doesn't have to be afraid. He can be tortured and executed because he's completely let go into the will of God. That is the depth of the spirituality of nonviolence Jesus teaches us in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's how you become totally nonviolent. That's what Gandhi did. Dear friends, you know I'm a Martin Luther King fanatic. Poor Martin, the night before, we've all heard his speech, "I've been to the promised land." Just before that, he said, "It's no longer violence or nonviolence, it's nonviolence or non-existence." And his last sentence is, "I don't know about me anymore. I just want to do God's will." His story became the Garden of Gethsemane, the Jesus story. This is very deep waters, friends. And this is the way forward to our own deaths and to change the world. It's the way of peace and justice. Number 8, we're almost done. The last words and final commandment of Jesus, put down the sword. Again, you may have read this in my writings or heard me talk about it, but to me, it's the culmination of the story of Jesus. Luke says, here come the soldiers, all the disciples, everyone said, Lord, do you want us to strike with the sword? And we're told one of the disciples charged the soldiers and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his ear with the sword. Later, 50 years later, the Gospel of John says the one who struck with the sword was none other than Peter, the leader of the community. And as I always say, Peter is so terrified and scared of getting killed that he resorts to not being surrendered and violence of the world, which he's had 3 years of retreats on nonviolence. He heard the Sermon on the Mount. He was front row seats at the Sermon on the Mount, and he goes to kill. And he's thinking, if violence is ever divinely justified, if there was ever a just war in history, if there was ever a moment when we were divinely told to kill, this is it. We have to kill to protect the Holy One. And he's right. He goes to get the sword because you got to kill to protect poor Jesus. And just as Peter goes to kill to protect Jesus, the commandment comes down. Put down the sword. As I always say, dear friends, these are the last words of Jesus to the church. It's the last thing that the whole community of men and women around him, his best friends, heard him say. Put down the sword. And it's the first time they totally understood Jesus, that he was really serious about love your enemies and be totally nonviolent. And they finally get it. And what do? They all run away and leave him because they are totally scared and they don't want to be nonviolent, which means the community would have all been arrested and killed with Jesus, which is probably what should have happened, frankly. And eventually they are. And that's what we should be willing to do, give our lives to end the killing in the world. So it's very deep waters here. Where are you in the story? What would you have done? How are you running away from the nonviolent Jesus? Who do you want to take up a sword against? How is Jesus telling you to put down the sword, and how are you responding? What are you so scared of? You can see yourself in the story. You can reflect on your whole lives in the story, like some intense moments you had. And then you can take the Gethsemane story and apply it to the world. And I'll just leave you with the image there of Ukraine. No, we have to go and kill to protect the Holy One. Put down the sword. All Christians have rejected the nonviolence of Jesus. That's the story. And he goes away to his death. So that's number 9. My 9th point is about the trials and appearances before Pilate and Herod, and they're totally confusing and they make no sense. And I keep, over the years, I've read them and compared them. They're just a mess. And I have been in and out of court. I'm not promoting myself here. I'm just sharing. I've been in court hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. Because if you've been arrested, especially for felonies like I have, you go to court back and forth. It's a total nightmare. There's no justice. So to me, the accounts of the trials of Jesus make perfect sense. Totally makes sense. Having been in court for the last 40 years. I've been arraigned many times like Trump is about to be arraigned. So what do I point out for you here? A couple of things. He's in Luke, he's brought to the house of the high priest and he's ridiculed, harassed, mocked, and beaten. They blindfold him, they strike him, they say, who's the one who hit you? Meanwhile, Peter is warming his hands in the charcoal fire and denying he even knows Jesus. And Luke says Jesus turned and looked at him, and Peter remembered that Jesus had said, you're gonna deny knowing me within an hour. And Peter goes away weeping. Then Jesus is hauled before the Sanhedrin, which is the high court. It's like the Senate, let's say, like a Senate hearing, and the ruling body, and they interrogate him and charge him with blasphemy. And then he's dragged before Herod. He doesn't say anything. Then he's dragged before Pilate. Someone will say the Sanhedrin, Pilate, back to the Sanhedrin, and back to Pilate. And they all accuse him of everything, and they all make up all kinds of charges against him and attack him and mock him. Luke says there's 3 charges against him. Stirring up the people, telling the people not to pay taxes, and claiming to be a king. So those are capital crimes, deserving capital punishment. And Luke's helpful that way, actually naming them. This is real serious legal charges against Jesus. That's the key here. The religious authorities stir up the crowd, calling for his execution. And the thing that's amazing for us is throughout all of this, Jesus is totally nonviolent. He's completely centered and 100% surrendered to God. He's 100% surrendered to his beloved God, the one who's first said to him by the river, "You are my beloved." Now he's totally there. And this is our journey too, so that his last words will be, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." He's already there. And that's why he's not yelling, screaming, carrying on, cussing them out, trying to fight back, all the violence that the whole world we see every day. He's surrendered, and so he's nonviolent, and that's what we're called to. Now, having been in and out of court with the Berrigans, I remember 30 years ago, holy Toledo, we were arrested, Dan Berrigan and I, on Good Friday, and we spent the day in jail. In fact, as I recall, they arraigned us in court. And so we got talking about this in jail, and only Daniel Berrigan. So that's why the Gandhi's theology is so incredible, because he lived the Jesus story. And so his reading of it is much deeper than any other scripture commentaries you get. And Dan said to me, notice in most of the accounts, Jesus does not say anything. He's silent before Pilate. That means in the incredible writing minds of the evangelists, Jesus is the judge. And everybody else in the story is being judged by Jesus, the nonviolent judge, as all are we are. This is an infinitely rich thing if you want to go there and reflect on it. The next thing, of course, is that he's brought into the praetorium after he's sentenced to death, and 600 Roman soldiers, the whole cohort, surround Jesus. Now, we know this. That's what the text said. Matthew says the cohort. They would have been 600 bored, drunken mass murderers, Roman soldiers, like the death squads of El Salvador. And they are out of their minds with boredom. And here's this crazy guy claiming to be a king, and they let loose and brutally torture him and mock him as if he's a king with the thorns on his head. And these are 600 soldiers mocking and torturing the most nonviolent person who ever lived, who claimed to be bringing a new world of universal peace where there's no more war. It's the most anti-military image in all of human history, and it's totally ignored, beginning by Christians, and it plays out every day in the world. That's why no Christian can have anything to do with any military, much less have a gun or build nuclear weapons. Otherwise, you are like the soldiers in the story, or the rulers, the Pilate, the religious authorities, destroying and killing Jesus all over again. Our goal is to be like him and to follow him. But it's in John's gospel, my last point about the trials, is where he sums up the whole message by saying, to Pilate. This is John 18, verse 36, if you want to write it down. It's another very important verse, maybe the most important in the whole Bible. My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom did belong to this world, my attendants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Judeans. But as it is, my kingdom is not here. In other words, friends, the only difference between the kingdom of God and the world is violence and nonviolence. In Jesus' kingdom, where he is king, there is no fighting, which means there's no violence, which means there's no war, no killing, no weapons, no guns, no nuclear weapons, and no tears and no death, no war. It's a realm of infinite nonviolence and universal love. The world is total violence and permanent warfare and killing people. If my kingdom were of this world, my people would be fighting, taking up the sword to defend me, but it's not of this world, it's of the world of total nonviolence, and so my people are not defending me with violence. We're either citizens of the nonviolent kingdom of God or citizens of the violent kingdoms of this world. So which side are you on, as the old song goes? If we want to remain Christians, we have to become nonviolent and not be part of the kingdoms of violence anymore, which is why I say you can't have anything to do with America. I invite you to pray over this and to choose Jesus's kingdom of nonviolence. But there's that lovely word I invite you to ponder to. If my kingdom did belong to this world, my attendants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. We are called to be the attendants of the nonviolent Jesus. So how are you an attendant of the nonviolent Jesus? Well, the last words of Jesus, number 10, my God, why have you abandoned me? That's the first sentence of Psalm 22, which starts in total despair, but moves into total hope. Spectacular. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. How is Jesus able to forgive his killers? Because he forgave everyone at every moment who ever hurt him, at every moment of his life. He's always forgiving, and he's always surrendering the beginnings of resentments. He's surrendering everything to God, so he's totally free. So I invite you to reflect on how you are forgiving everyone who ever hurt you and surrendering all the roots of your lack of forgiveness, which is resentment. Let it all go to God and move into unconditional forgiveness and total nonviolence and daily surrendering to God, like Jesus. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, living in relationship with God, in total surrender to God. And that's the key to nonviolence. And that's where you and I are headed. Jesus is teaching us and training us how to live and die nonviolently, not violently. I could go on, and I do in this book, but just a few thoughts about resurrection. The death of Jesus is meticulously legal, and so his resurrection is totally illegal. It does civil disobedience all over again. He breaks out of the tomb. He's out and about. He's illegally stirring up trouble. He's organizing his bottom-up grassroots people power movement of nonviolence. He's as nonviolent as he ever was. He comes back and he doesn't yell at them or get mad at them or say, how dare you? You know, he's not resentful. Why did you let me go and abandon me? There's no retaliation. He doesn't call for revenge against Pilate. He forgives everyone. He loves everyone. He says, here's my gift of peace, and breathes the Holy Spirit on them and sends them out to carry on his mission of global nonviolence. And that's what Jesus is doing with us this week. I invite you to spend the Easter season welcoming Jesus's resurrection gift of peace and unpacking the politics of resurrection nonviolence and accepting his mission of becoming an apostle and a missionary of resurrection nonviolence. Resurrection means having nothing to do with death, which means resurrection means total nonviolence, which means we're headed toward having not a trace of violence or death in us. So by practicing nonviolence and following Jesus, we're actually getting ready for the new life of resurrection peace, where we will never again have anything to do with death, but instead be living in God's new reign of resurrection peace. Thank you for listening to me, everybody. and for your patience with me. I'm going to take comments or questions, and we have about 20 or 25 minutes, and then I'll end the recording, and those who want to stay on a little bit longer are welcome to do so. So let me see if there's any question. No, there's no questions in the chat box. Yeah, there's not one question. So I don't know. If you have a question, just raise your hand for now, okay? Raise your hand up like that so I can see you, and I will try to call on people, and I will unmute you. So keep your hand up if you've got a question or a comment. Okay, Celeste, why don't you start us off? And then I see Terry, and hold on, Celeste, and Harry. Wait, hold on a sec. One more second. Celeste, where are you? If you can unmute yourself, great.
Yeah,
Or keep your hand up, Celeste. Okay, go ahead. What's your question?
My question is, what are the implications of what you're laying out for several things? One is the predominant atonement theory theology, especially, I think it's especially powerful at this time of year. The idea that in some way, Jesus' death is the fault of God, who is requiring some kind of redemptive sacrifice. You know the kind of talk that's heard at this time of year. And then some other things that are less profound, but more practical, shall we say. What are the implications for people who are a part of the system, as we all are? We're paying taxes. We're kind of, deferring to the status quo in many, many ways, hopefully not through violence, but if we pay taxes, we know where our taxes go to. And then the other question, which is, it might sound trivial, but the implications, it's always seemed to me, of extreme nonviolence, radical nonviolence, is that we all need to be vegetarians. So I'm just wondering about.
Okay, thank you.
Thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. So you said a lot, and that's really great. Happily, we are living in a time, the first time in history, the last few decades, where we're beginning to unpack a new theology of nonviolence and a spirituality of nonviolence. And you can get my book, The God of Peace, which is a theology of nonviolence, and our work with Pope Francis, where he's begun to unpack that finally in his World Day of Peace message. And there's a lot of good stuff coming out of it. But in terms of the atonement theology, the question of sacrifice, God needing the blood of Jesus to save us, none of that's true. All of that's changing as we're finally beginning to understand Jesus the way the early church did. If you support violence and killing, you need a violent, killing God. If God has nothing to do with violence, we don't understand God is universal love and total nonviolence. God doesn't want Jesus to be killed. God doesn't need Jesus to be killed. It doesn't work that way. And that's why none of us understand this. But it's all right there in the gospel if you want to understand it. Gandhi figured it out. Martin Luther King figured it out. All kinds of saints figured it out. I'm thinking of my heroes, Franz Jägerstätter and Sophie Scholl, for example. But there are many, many people. And I don't have the language to do. I've been writing about this in my big, big book coming out next year, at the end of this year, The Gospel of Peace. But for example, you can Google some new books on this. There's one called The Nonviolent Atonement, for example. When I say Mass, for example, I never use the word sacrifice. I always talk about the gift of reconciliation. That's why, and I'm saying stuff real quick because we're almost out of time, Celeste, but Mel Gibson's movie was so wrong, The Passion of the Christ, because it looks like Jesus was randomly chosen out of the crowd and killed. And so that we got his blood, we're all saved and we're off the hook. And by the way, then you don't have to follow Jesus because you're saved. And therefore you can go and kill the people of Iraq or the Nazis or anybody. And because we're saved, we're good American Christians. Baloney. The theology of nonviolence turns the whole thing upside down. Jesus is Gandhi and king. If you're going to be marching to Washington, D.C. in a poor people's campaign, and you're going to end all economic injustice and end the Vietnam War, you got to kill King. You have to kill Gandhi. And you have to kill Jesus. If you're running the Roman Empire and the religious authorities are making millions in effect off the Roman, I'm just saying this quickly to stir your mind. So Jesus is killed not by God, but by the soldiers, by the empire, and with the collaboration of religious authorities. Just as Gandhi and King were not killed by God. And the whole thing is not about the sacrifice, and it's about follow me. Discipleship. Take up this way of the cross, which is radical resistance and total nonviolence to the whole culture of violence and war. And that's why Dorothy said, the measure of your discipleship to Jesus is how much trouble you're in. You know, this is a whole new theology. And actually, like in the last 10 years, you're only beginning to see some of this. Gandhi and King never wrote like this. I think I'm one of the first people who actually did. But that's just because I was obsessed with this when I was 21. I'm just saying that's how new we are. That's all I'm saying. This in my lifetime, this is totally new theology. And the Vatican is now beginning to understand it. It's amazing. We're living in a hopeful time that way. Very briefly, you can't pay taxes if you're following Jesus in this story. You can't be a soldier. You can't have a gun. You can't have anything to do with the culture of violence and war. Therefore, you can't have anything to do with anything that brings violence. And you can't be eating animals, much less killing animals, much less killing children, or sitting by and do nothing while there are 13,000 nuclear weapons ready to vaporize the whole planet. Or while we're headed now into total catastrophic climate change. Like it's normal to just let them continue to, dig up all that land, for example, in Alaska, that's about to happen, for more fossil fuels, even though we know that's the end of the earth, and so forth and so on. Call on Terry next, real quick. Thanks. I'm sorry for a long answer. I'll unmute you, Terry. And then Harry. Go ahead, Terry. Oh, yeah, there you are.
Okay. Father, hi. Thank you so much for all of this. It resonates very strongly with me. My question is, do you know of any Catholic United States seminaries which teach nonviolence, or any seminaries in the world?
You're not going to like my answer. No.
Okay.
Not a one. And I've
Okay.
been working on this, and I was in correspondence with the head of the Bishops' Conference in the year 2000 about this 20 years ago. In fact, they really, really teach violence and the just war theory and the need for nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not saying this lightly or flippantly. It's called ethics, and it's baloney. It has nothing to do with the nonviolent Jesus. Now, I've thought about this every day, Terry, for 40 years and angst over it. So I'll just say in a nutshell, as the church in the US and elsewhere in the world has moved so far right in this terrible moment we're living through. For example, though, for 1700 years, all leaders were taught, every Christian man and woman was taught the just war theory and violence. We are living in an amazing time where nonviolence is coming. We're being taught more about it than ever before. Well, we have to, because we're about to destroy the planet. But for example, an unknown fact about Dorothy Day is that throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, on every trip she ever made, she asked to meet with the seminarians. In those days, you could do that. She was famous enough and revered enough. maybe 10 seminarians would meet with her, and she'd teach them nonviolence and service of the poor. And a generation of priests in the 60s came up who were open to Dorothy Day. And that led to the 60s and 70s and 80s. One of the things that's happened by the year 2000, all the seminaries were closed. No speakers are allowed in. Now every parish in the United States is closed. You basically can't bring in a speaker. It's very hard to do. Anyway, we're working to change all that, Terry. So let me move on to Harry. Harry, you
Okay.
have a question? If you unmute yourself there. I'll try to unmute you. Hold on. No, you try to unmute yourself, Harry. There you go. No. Harry, okay, there you are. I can hear you. Go ahead.
John, I want to simplify what you said all afternoon. And that is that I believe, my faith tells me that God sent the second person of the Blessed Trinity in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The purpose he sent him into the world was to get us to stop killing each other and to start loving each other. That's why he came. That's the whole story.
That's very helpful, Harry. Thanks so much. He came that we all get to live now in heaven on earth. Universal love, universal compassion, total nonviolence, universal peace. That's why Gandhi went much farther than all of us. Well, he uses the word nonviolence. Gandhi said the kingdom of God is nonviolence. And it just boggles my mind. He said the highest human state is nonviolence. So it's a very simple story. And that's why I quoted Dan saying, well, we don't want that. We showed Jesus the door. And it's easy to dismiss everybody else on the planet except for ourselves. Hey, I wouldn't have done that. I'm just saying it's Holy Week, friends. Let's go slow. We are all brainwashed in this culture of violence and war. We all need to repent. We all need to turn around and figure out, where are we on the story? How far do you want to go on the journey of nonviolence with the nonviolent Jesus? Do you want to go to the cross and resurrection? So Greg and then Floyd. Thank you, Harry. You can mute yourself, Harry. Go ahead, unmute yourself, Greg.
Sorry.
There you
John.
are, Greg.
Thank you. What you've spoken about is so profound. And, as you say, we have been so brainwashed in a culture of violence. And as a man, I was brought up with violent sports here in Canada, hockey being number one. And, and then there's a whole host of other sports. And, as you say, the culture of violence just permeates everything. Canada now is among one of the most warlike countries on the planet with our leadership. And I'm just wondering, I was introduced to Dan Berrigan, I guess 20 years ago, and have really tried to follow in their footsteps. But I still face an immense amount of violence in myself. The war in Ukraine makes me furious. And, I find myself sometimes hoping for the defeat of NATO, which means death. And so how do I deal with my own internal struggle against violence? Even in my relationship with my children and my family, I get angry and, overreact to things. The surrender part you talk about is so beautiful, so powerful, but I feel so far
Thank
away.
you so much. Yeah, thank you, Greg, and you can mute yourself. I've been grappling with those questions my entire life. That's why I teach and do this work. I have a lot of thoughts on it, but I think that you and I, Greg, are just completely, thoroughly, totally brainwashed by violence, and everybody in the churches not just in the United States, but the whole world. And everybody of every race, and both men and women, and young and old, it's a world of brainwashing and violence. Well, after thousands of years of it, you know, oh, they have nuclear weapons, they want to blow up the planet. You go, oh, that's too bad. I got to watch the football game. So we have our work cut out for us, Greg, with this spectacular story of Jesus. You might want to study my book, The Nonviolent Life, where I say you need to do 3 things at the same time. 1, you're working on total inner nonviolence. 2, the same time you're working at meticulous nonviolence toward every human being and every creature on the earth. And 3, you have to do something to be part of the global movement of nonviolence. I mean, working on yourself is not enough now. Things are so bad. You have to be doing something to end the destruction of Mother Earth or war. Whether or not you're effective is not the question. You're called to be part of the movement, the Jesus movement. That's what I'm trying to get at. So in terms of interior, yeah, we can become nonviolent. I have friends who have done that. I'm not there. But I know friends, and I know great people who really achieved it. I do believe Gandhi and Dr. King achieved it. For example, I know Thich Nhat Hanh and Tutu and Coretta Scott King did it. I don't think Mother Teresa did it, but that's a different story. She was a lot of fun, though, but she was a tough cookie. But you see my point, and I would say Dan and Phil Berrigan would be the first to say we were not there, but we were on the journey. And that's the thing we're called to. You have to incorporate a lot of Buddhist work. Greg, you're brainwashed by the culture to say, they better kill Putin, we better kill the Russians, or crush NATO, or whatever it is. Everything's got to collapse. The whole world of war has to end. Yes, NATO has to end, but so does the Russian military, the Ukraine military, the US military, the Canadian military. All weapons need to be dismantled. You're going, John, that's ridiculous. No, that's the kingdom of God come on earth. And that's why nobody has worked on this. And we spent trillions for war. And, you know, you don't realize it, everybody, but there's a great hero in our midst named Mel Duncan, who's worked with the Nonviolent Peace Force, hi Mel, trying to get people to begin to practice nonviolence on the frontline war zones. That's the future. So don't be listening to the culture's propaganda, the culture of war, which is trying to tell the church to be angry and violent on the side of war. And every good American does that, or Canadian or whoever. Instead, listen to the Gospels and study Gandhi and King and all the teachers of nonviolence. And work on letting go of your inner violence and anger. That's why I very consciously use the word surrender, which is an ancient Christian mystical practice. The minute, I'm giving you a little trick here, Greg. Your kid does something and you want to yell at him or strike him. You're driving down the road and somebody cuts in front of him and you want to yell at him or strike him. Or somebody makes a snide remark to you, or you just wake up in the middle of the night and you remembered somebody said something to you 10 years ago and you've got resentment. Immediately you say, God, I surrender that resentment, that anger, that thought to you. And I pray for Joe, whoever. You name that person, bless that person. When you do that, you've let it go and you've surrendered your violence to God. And that's how you begin to receive Jesus's resurrection gift of peace. Actually writing a whole book on that right now. Pray for me. Floyd. Okay, bye, Greg. Go ahead, Floyd.
Okay, thank you. It's such a pleasure.
Real loud, Floyd. I can't hear you. Reverend Floyd.
Okay, can you hear me now?
No, very barely.
Can you hear
Barely.
me? Can you hear me?
A little bit. I'll probably have to repeat your question, but go ahead.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to meet you. Your book, The Nonviolent Life, was my first introduction or foray into this concept of nonviolence. I have, let me get to my question. I'm struggling because there's there's a lot of violence in the community in which my context is. a lot of inner violence in the urban setting. I'm wondering, the context that you're speaking about, war, nuclear weapons, and so forth, I'm seeing that as a macro kind of societal issue.
Right. Yeah.
However, I'm living day to day when I see 4 and 5 people getting killed in my community
Right.
due to gun violence. Is this concept of nonviolence applicable on the ground as well as over in Ukraine and the rest of the world? And the last thing I'll say is that my heart grieves. And I wonder what Dr. King would be doing with so much violence in African-American communities, not to mention the mass shootings that are going on. So I followed your book to a T, and I'm still doing it. And one of the things that you said was get involved with the grassroots movement, which is what I've done right here in North Carolina. However, they don't seem to have the burden for inner city violence as I do. So could you speak to that if you could? Thank you.
Reverend Floyd, thank you so much. That's terrific. You know everything already. Follow your heart and your lead. You're making the connections. I mean, I've talked for an hour and a half, and I've talked for a whole week just on this topic. So a few quick thoughts. You're talking about, you're right, because we were talking about violence in the heart inside, and the violence in Ukraine, and the violence of nuclear weapons, and the violence of catastrophic climate change. Floyd, there's a billion things, other forms of violence, beginning with the inner cities, beginning with the shootings here. Or if we were in Sudan, the mass starvation, you know? So there's so much to talk about. Where nonviolence is tried, we now know it works. The movements in the US are very weak right now. Black Lives Matter was the strongest, great movement, but it needed, according to Jim Lawson, to advocate the Kingian language of nonviolence more and more. You have to use the word, Floyd. There are groups and places using the word and trying it. And that's why through Pace Bene and Campaign Nonviolence, you might want to Google this. I started this project called the Nonviolent Cities Project. And it was begun in Carbondale, Illinois. And this is a project where you get outside of your church group or your peace and justice group, and you get your whole city, beginning with police, politicians, every religious leader, every grassroots movement together and say the future of our community is nonviolent. That's where Martin Luther King was going, to say, how do we get communities to become nonviolent? So we have to teach ourselves to be nonviolent. You teach your kids nonviolence. You teach the police to be nonviolent. You teach them to get rid of their guns, and you teach them not to join the military and work at the bomb factory down the street. And you teach them to have, you know what they did in Carbondale? One of the things they learned was they had no access to good food. So they set up incredible organic farmers markets throughout the city. Through this movement, the violence went down. You know what I mean, Floyd. Anyway, it's making the connections, and you're a leader. That's what needs to happen in North Carolina. I've had this conversation with our friend Reverend Barber, and I've done events with him over the years, and he's not using the word as much as I want him to. I've had the same conversation with the Vatican, because I think the word is where the power is. Go back and listen to the recording on YouTube of Kazu Hagu's talk on Dr. King's nonviolence last October. It was brilliant, where he talked about the Kingian language of nonviolence in a new way. We're all of this is new, Floyd. I mean, it's amazing. And poor Martin Luther King knew all this and he never even talked about Jesus that much. We're making new ground, but what he and Gandhi did, we'll never fully understand. But what would King be doing? He was doing just what Jesus was doing. He would be grieving, and then he would be taking nonviolent action. That's what Jesus did. He doesn't, notice Jesus is not raging with anger. He grieves. There's a difference there. And notice Jesus is not afraid. He grieves. These are the emotional life of nonviolence. And on the other hand, he doesn't despair and give up. He takes action. He takes action, takes action. That's why I say get with the movements. Now, having said all that, friends, I'm very mindful of the time. I've gone an hour and a half. So I'm proposing that I'm going to wrap it up here, say a little, give a little commercial, say a little prayer. But those who want to stay on a little longer are welcome to if you want to. But this is just for the sake of the recording. I realize there's probably everybody here has something to say and a comment or question. And I presume too that you don't agree with what I say. And that's totally fine. From my perspective, I am offering you my take on the Holy Week story of Jesus from Gandhian, Kingian nonviolence, which is a whole new way of approaching the scriptures. And I invite you, do you agree with it or not? Does it help you understand who Jesus is and who you are called to be? And this is not just a one-time thing. That's why I began by saying, I hope you can take some of this and mull over it. Make Holy Week this week, Good Friday and Easter, a little retreat with you on nonviolence for yourself, maybe your spouse or partner or friends or church group, to deepen in your own Christian nonviolence and your journey with Jesus. The phrase that I like is to accompany Jesus on his journey. That's what we're called to do. It's lovely. So at the Beatitudes Center, there's I went a little nuts and I've got all these fantastic people doing Zooms coming up through October. In 2 weeks from today, Bishop John Stowe, my friend, who's the president of Pax Christi, he's from Louisville, is going to do a great talk on Fratelli Tutti, which was Pope Francis's teachings, the last encyclical from 3 years ago on living as one with all of humanity, which of course gets into nonviolence and peacemaking. And he uses as a basis of his story, of his text, the Good Samaritan story. That's going to be great. Then we have Frida Berrigan talking about the 100th anniversary of her father's, Philip Berrigan, and his witness, my great friends. Frank Cordero in June talking about the nonviolent Jesus and the war-making church. Then two of the most important environmentalists on the planet are speaking. Literally the first one who ever wrote about a theology of the environment. Larry Rasmussen, my friend, will be here June 17th. And maybe the first one who wrote about climate change, perhaps, the leading activist, Bill McKibben, will be joining us on June 24th. This is a real honor, friends. So please get 10 people to come. My friend Joe Brown, who's a Jesuit priest, a few African-American priests in the United States, going to be talking about racism and nonviolence. And then Medea Benjamin, July 29th, maybe the leading anti-war activists in the United States, going to talk about peace and nonviolence, but particularly about Ukraine, Russia, NATO. If you're interested in that, you can. And how does peace and nonviolence apply to that? That's what she just published a book on it. And there's more. Cornell West is really excited. And Adam Bucko, I don't even remember who else. But Zugby, my friend of 40 years, is going to be live from Palestine. One of the greatest people I know of nonviolence in the planet is going to be with us. So please join us and get others to join us. Let's have a 2-second prayer to end, and then I'll end the recording. God of peace, thank you for the nonviolent Jesus who came among us and loved us infinitely and walked the path of daring, radical nonviolence all the way to the cross and into the new life of resurrection peace. Bless us this Holy Week, that we too may take a new step forward on his path of active, daring nonviolence, that we might surrender ourselves and do your will, that we might be apostles and prophets and missionaries of gospel nonviolence to your poor world, that we might help the church walk the way of the cross as nonviolent resistance and practice resurrection, that we might do our part to follow Jesus and welcome your reign of total nonviolence here on earth. We ask this mighty blessing in Jesus' name. Thanks everybody for listening. God bless you. I'm going to end the recording now. Thank you.